Welcome to the devotional series, Pondering the Parables, the podcast edition, episode 14, subtitled Wrapping Up the Kingdom of Heaven is Like Parables and Creating a Theology About Eternity. And I'm Pastor D-Wog. We are now through the Kingdom of Heaven is Like Parables. We studied 13 of those parables, all of which are describing in some fashion the kingdom of heaven. And we've talked about the fact that the kingdom of heaven is actually a euphemism, a way for pious Jews and righteous people to avoid using the name of God. So the kingdom of heaven is really a euphemism for the kingdom of God is like. And through 13 of these parables, we've been able to really get a good feeling, a good description by Jesus himself of what eternity is going to be like. And one of the things that we've realized is that eternity starts now, and that there are so many elements of the kingdom of God, of eternity, that we are experiencing now. It's almost as if this is a practice session for eternity. And I would argue that that's what this life on this earth is about. So I thought today what we would do in episode 14 is to review very briefly those 13 parables that we've talked about. And then I will read to you my theology of eternity as a result of studying these parables. And one of the things that I've realized in doing this study and in my decades of study is the way that heaven is described, or the way that eternity is described in North America, I think is vastly different than what is really happening in the Bible through Jesus's descriptions and through some of the other books of the Bible. We are not going to be sitting around on clouds with wings on our backs, eating grapes for a billion years. It seems like the most boring thing in the world for me that I could imagine eternity to be like. I think it's exactly the opposite. And that's what we're going to explore here today and sum it all up with a theology about eternity. So let's review the 13 parables that we've already reflected upon. I'm going to go to the glasses here. It's a long list, and I don't want to forget any of them. First, we started with the workers in the vineyard from Matthew chapter 20, a parable about generosity, grace, and God's justice as opposed to man's justice. Then we looked at the needing woman from chapter 13 of Matthew. This is a parable that describes the extreme hospitality of the kingdom of God through a remez that takes us back into Genesis. Then we studied the parable of the mustard seeds, also from Matthew chapter 13. And this is a parable that describes the amazing growth from virtually nothing that the kingdom of God experiences. And that growth comes from unexpected places, like a mustard plant, which is really a weed, but grows into a big tree that can house the birds. Then we studied the parable of the treasure and the parable of the pearl. These two kind of go hand in hand. And they describe the extreme value and the extreme joy represented by the kingdom of God. But that extreme value and that extreme joy comes at extreme cost. And we could argue that the cost of that was Jesus's life himself. Then we studied the parable of the weeds from Matthew chapter 13. A parable talks about patience in the present kingdom, waiting for the eternal kingdom to come. And this helps to describe that the kingdom of God is not just in the future, it's here and now. So we describe it as the here and now, but not yet. But in the meantime, as we wait for the coming kingdom, patience is required. Then we looked at the parable of the nets, which is a parable of promise because of the harvest of fish. But it's also a warning because part of that harvest comes with the sorting out of the fish that weren't good to eat. So we see here in this parable, along with the parable of the weeds that we just described, two examples of kingdom of God exhibiting an element of judgment. Of the 13 parables, 7 of them have elements of judgment involved. Then comes the parable of the sower. That's the beginning of chapter 13. And this is kind of the executive summary that kind of overlooks all of the kingdom of his like parables from chapter 13 of Matthew. And it's basically another remez back to Isaiah 6, which is a warning and an exhortation to the people of Israel to accept the kingdom of God, to lean into the kingdom of God rather than to reject it. And again, because 7 of the 13 parables that we studied have elements of judgment to it, and we don't like to think of the kingdom of God as having those elements of judgment, we have to understand that accepting the kingdom, accepting the invitation to the kingdom, and then doing kingdom work is part of what our job here is on earth. Then we looked at the parable of the unforgiving servant from Matthew chapter 17. And through the story of an unforgiving servant, we understand that the kingdom of God is actually one of extreme forgiveness, but judgment if you aren't a forgiving person. Then we looked at the parable of the wedding banquet, which comes from Matthew chapter 22. And this is a parable that talks about accepting the invitation into the kingdom of God. And then when you accept that invitation, bringing your best, every skill that you have, every talent that you have, all of what you are and what you have to bear for the kingdom. And then we looked at the parable of the 10 virgins from Matthew chapter 25. And this is a parable, again, for the present, here and now portion of the kingdom. We always need to be prepared, the old Boy Scout saying, because we don't know the time or the date when Jesus will come again to usher in eternity. And so preparation here in the here and now, doing kingdom work now, is a key element of the kingdom of God. Then we looked at the parable of the talents, which really builds upon the parable of the 10 virgins. This is in Matthew chapter 25 as well. Do your job. You have been given time, talent, and treasure by God, and you are to use that time, talent, and treasure for the kingdom in preparation for when he comes back. Then we looked at the parable of the growing seed, which is an outlier in that it's from Mark chapter 4. And once again, we understand that the kingdom is an amazing growing organism. It's a great growing kingdom, and it grows automatically just because God's the one doing it. But that God often partners with us and asks us to partner with him in helping to expand the kingdom. So those are our 13 parables. And I wanted to try to bring it together for my own mind more formally. So I wrote this Theology of the Kingdom of Heaven, which is a reverent way to say the kingdom of God, which in turn is a theology of the kingdom of God in eternity. And theologies are usually pretty formal, and that's why I wanted to write this down. And I thought it would be a good exercise for me to read that to you here as we close out this portion of our Pondering the Parables. We'll move on to some other parables in coming weeks, and we'll also return to the Psalms as well. So here it is, a theology of the kingdom of God in eternity. We live in the kingdom now, but also not yet. We have the invitation and the opportunity to participate in the kingdom by contributing every attribute and skill that we have to its ever-expanding reign. The kingdom is a place and a state of being, which is miraculously and automatically growing and developing in the least expected places, sometimes through God's almighty Spirit alone, but oftentimes also in partnership with us. Yes, we have jobs to do in the kingdom, and it is a place and a state of being where generosity, grace, mercy, forgiveness, and justice, God's justice, prevails. The kingdom is a valuable place that has cost everything to build. And so those who experience it understand its preciousness and can't contain their gratitude, joy, and excitement for each new day. We experience this kingdom in the present world, even though oftentimes it seems hidden to us. We recognize that while the kingdom is here and now in glimpses, it is also not yet. And God has invited us to prepare the way patiently for his coming day of his return, where he will usher us into eternity to experience all that he has described in these parables and even more. The kingdom won't be like what we have been taught. There will be no wings or sitting on clouds eating grapes for millions of years. What a boring way to spend eternity. No, eternity will look a lot like what we see each day, but with newness, freshness, and new creation each morning. That's told to us in Revelation chapter 21. There will be tasks to do for the kingdom's sake, and worship to lift up, and maybe mission work to be done in unknown realms in different dimensions, bringing the gospel of Yeshua to peoples and creatures that God has established and is establishing, I believe, since the beginning of time. But beware, there is much to do here until his arrival and the ushering in of eternity. He has given us time, talent, and treasure to steward for the kingdom. We must steward well, not for our sake, but for the kingdom's sake. Those who do not, and those who reject the presence and the existence of the kingdom will be judged, and that judgment will be eternal and fierce. So, Choose to accept the kingdom and choose to live today in anticipation of the coming eternal kingdom of God. Prepare yourself patiently, be ready and alert, and live in anticipation of the day of his return. Shalom and Godspeed. Pastor D. Walk signing out.